I was just doing homework, or at least trying to, until she closed the door behind her. That click, it was subtle, almost polite, but it carried something heavier, like the room itself had been shifted an inch closer to some invisible edge. I looked up from my notebook at the quiet tap of her heels on the wooden floor. She leaned against the doorway for a second, arms crossed, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips, and my chest betrayed me with a sudden flutter I didn't know I could still feel. The bookstore smelled like old paper and sun-bleached pages, with a faint trace of coffee from the cafe at the back. I liked to come here when I needed to escape the chaos of classes, the hum of fluorescent lights in the dorms. The afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, casting long shadows over the stacks of books, and for some reason, it made everything about her sharper. Her silver-streaked hair catching the light like it was made of strands of something uncatchable, the quiet confidence in the way she held herself, like she owned every inch of the space without needing to claim it. "Still buried in numbers?" she asked, her voice low, smooth, like she was used to people listening, but not really expecting them to. She didn't wait for an answer. Instead, she walked over and set a steaming cup of coffee on the table beside me. I glanced down at it, then back at her, and she only smiled again, just slightly, like she'd shared a joke with herself and left me out, but maybe not entirely. I mumbled a thanks, my hand brushing hers as I reached for the cup. She didn't flinch. That was the oddest part. How small contact could feel both dangerous and natural at the same time. She moved around the table, pulling a chair out with a slow grace that made the sound of wood on wood echo too loudly in my ears. I realized I was holding my breath. "I wasn't expecting anyone here," she said, settling across from me, her notebook of receipts open in front of her. She fiddled with a pen, tapping it against the page, her eyes flicking up to mine every few seconds. It wasn't intrusive, but it was heavy in a way I couldn't explain. Like she was studying me without trying to, like she already knew what she'd find. I tried to focus on my math homework, tried to force my pencil to move. But every time I looked up, there she was again, watching, smiling faintly, tilting her head. And each time, I felt something I didn't have words for, something that made the air feel sticky, made my ears warm, made the idea of closing this notebook suddenly unbearable. She sipped her coffee, then leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table. "You work too hard," she said softly, almost to herself. I wasn't sure if she meant me or just the concept of youth trying to outrun itself. Either way, the way she said it made me feel like I'd been caught somewhere I shouldn't have been, but maybe it was the kind of caught that didn't hurt. Then she stood up, stretched lightly, and for a moment, the light caught the lines of her face, the subtle imperfections that somehow made her seem real, untouchable, and achingly close all at once. She moved to the door, and I thought the moment would end there, normal and polite. But she closed the door behind her with that same click, leaving me with the faint scent of coffee and something else, something sharp, a trace of presence that made the quiet between us feel like it was holding its breath. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. I didn't expect to see her again the next afternoon, not so soon. Yet there she was, crouched behind the counter, untangling a stack of disorganized ledgers as if the world had no right to intrude. The bookstore was quieter this time. Sun dipped lower, painting everything in muted gold. I was halfway through reorganizing a shelf when she looked up, caught my eye, and offered that faint smile that made me hesitate mid-step. "Could you give me a hand with this?" she asked, her voice softer, almost uncertain. I nodded without thinking, moving toward her. She didn't shift her gaze away from the papers, but I noticed the slight tremor in her fingers as she handed me the first folder. There was a vulnerability in her that I hadn't seen before, subtle, fleeting, a shadow under her eyes, the way she exhaled just a fraction too long, like she was letting a part of herself show without intending to. I found myself studying her small gestures, the delicate curve of her wrist, the way her hair fell over one shoulder, how she tucked it back absent-mindedly, leaving a silver streak catching the sunlight. "You always do this alone?" I asked quietly, as if the question itself would disturb her. She glanced up then, just for a second, and I caught the flicker of something, hesitation? Fatigue? Or maybe it was both. I usually manage, she said finally, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Her laugh was a low, half-hidden thing, more of a breath than a sound, and I felt the odd pull in my chest again. She wasn't asking for help often, and yet, here she was, letting me linger in her world for a few stolen minutes. We worked in silence after that, our hands occasionally brushing when passing folders. I could feel the tension building, a quiet electricity that made it impossible to focus fully on the task. Every time she leaned closer to check something, the faint scent of her perfume, or maybe just her, rose in the air, and I realized I was holding my breath without even noticing. "I didn't think you'd actually come back," she murmured suddenly, not looking at me. Her voice carried a trace of something fragile, a vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. I stayed still, unsure of how to respond, just letting her words linger between us. I noticed how tired her shoulders looked, how her hands moved with precision but without ease. Small details, tiny human things that shouldn't have mattered, but they did. I wanted to ask if she needed a break, or a coffee, or something, anything, but the words didn't come. Instead, I simply handed her the next folder, our fingers brushing again, and felt a spark that made my stomach tighten. She paused, leaning back against the counter, and for a long moment, we just looked at each other. No words, no explanations, just the soft pull of something neither of us named but both felt, an unspoken recognition that this moment was fragile, that it was dangerous in its quietness. Then she smiled again, that faint, layered smile, and the corners of her eyes crinkled slightly. And when she did, I realized I couldn't stop staring, not at her face, not at the way the sunlight caught her hair, not at the subtle charge in the air between us. For a heartbeat, the bookstore was ours alone, and I didn't want it to end. The rain had started just as I was leaving the bookstore, soft at first, then heavier, drumming against the tall windows with a rhythm that made the quiet corners of the shop feel even smaller. I was about to step outside when she appeared behind the counter, holding an umbrella that looked far too big for just one person. "You're staying late again?" I asked, my voice lower than I intended. She didn't answer immediately, just tilted her head, eyes tracking mine, and there it was again, that subtle charge that made it impossible to think straight. "I had some things to finish," she said finally, fingers brushing against the edge of the register. Her tone was calm, but the small hesitation, the way her hand lingered, betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. I stepped closer to offer the umbrella, and for a moment, the space between us disappeared. Her gaze dropped to my hands, then back to mine, and I noticed how close we were. Close enough that I could see the soft line of her jaw, the faint tension in her neck. My own pulse seemed loud in the quiet room. "You always notice everything," she murmured, half smile, half scolding. I didn't respond. I just wanted to freeze the moment, to let it stretch indefinitely, but the rain outside was insistent, tapping against the windows, a reminder that the world beyond these four walls still existed. Then her phone buzzed sharply on the counter. She glanced at it, hesitated, and I saw the faint crease between her brows. A text from someone I didn't know, someone whose name was enough to make her lips press into a thin line. She sighed, tucked the phone into her pocket, and turned back to me. The umbrella trembled slightly in her grip as she held it for me. Our fingers brushed, again, this time lingering just a heartbeat longer than the last, and I wanted to say something, anything. To tell her that I felt it too, that I wanted to step closer and close the distance completely. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I watched her adjust her bag, the soft clink of the metal clasp, and forced myself to notice ordinary things. The gentle curve of her shoulder beneath the sweater, the slight tremor of her hand as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Every detail made my chest tighten, every small movement a reminder of how carefully I had to contain myself. "I should," she started, but stopped, as though whatever she intended to say was too dangerous, too revealing. The rain beat against the glass again, louder this time, and the world outside seemed to pulse in rhythm with the tension that hung between us. I inhaled slowly, wanting to close the gap, to reach for her, to brush that hesitation away. But I only offered a quiet, careful nod, letting the umbrella tilt slightly toward her so that our shoulders almost touched. Almost. And in that near touch, I realized how impossibly complicated this felt. How a single step could unravel everything. Yet leaving it unspoken made it ache in a way that words never could. The storm outside raged, and the air between us was heavy with what might have been. The bookstore was nearly empty that evening, the last customers having drifted out into the cold, leaving only the hum of the old heater and the soft rustle of pages. I was stacking books when I felt her presence behind me, not announced, just there. Close enough that the heat from her body brushed mine as she leaned slightly to reach a shelf. "You've been quiet all day," she said finally, voice low, almost fragile. Not teasing, not scolding, just noticing. I looked up, and our eyes met, lingering longer than usual. There was no playfulness here, no subtle flirtation, just a raw tension that neither of us could name. "You," she began, then stopped, her mouth pressing into a thin line as if the words she wanted to say were too dangerous to speak aloud. I swallowed hard, feeling the same impossible pull, and yet the weight of it made my chest tighten. "What are we doing?" she asked, finally letting the words slip, and the quiet that followed them made the air seem too small, too hot. I didn't answer immediately. How could I? The question wasn't about romance, not yet. It was about everything we weren't saying, all the tension that had been building since the first day she closed that door behind her. I shifted, trying to stack the books without touching her, but my hands trembled slightly. She sighed and leaned against the counter, arms crossed. The small tremble in her shoulders betrayed fatigue, or maybe just the vulnerability of admitting uncertainty. "I don't know," she whispered. "And maybe I shouldn't even be thinking about this. About you. About whatever this is." Her gaze fell to the floor, then back to mine, and I caught that tiny quiver of her lips, the subtle tightening of her fingers. I wanted to reach out, to say something to bridge the distance, but I only stayed frozen, aware of the impossibility of the space between us. We both knew that even speaking had changed something. The air was heavier now, charged in a way that made ordinary movement feel risky. She shifted slightly closer, but not enough to reach me, and I realized that this quiet, fragile conversation had already broken whatever pretense we had maintained. "I can't," she started again, voice trembling, then stopped. Her silence said more than words ever could. Fear, longing, confusion, and an awareness of how complicated things had become. I wanted to reassure her, to tell her that none of this had to be terrifying, but the truth was, I didn't even know what I wanted. I only knew that seeing her like this, so exposed in a way she rarely allowed, made the room feel unbearably small. She took a slow breath, eyes glistening, and whispered, almost to herself, "I don't want to ruin it, but I don't know how not to." And in that moment, the bookstore, the quiet stacks, the dim lights, the faint smell of coffee and old paper, felt like it was holding its breath. Like the world outside could shatter at the sound of one wrong word. I stayed still, unable to speak, and for the first time, I realized how devastating it could be to exist so close to someone and still be worlds apart. The next afternoon, I found her sitting behind the counter, a folded letter in her hand, her eyes tracing the creases over and over like she was memorizing something she couldn't yet speak. The bookstore smelled faintly of rain and old paper, the windows streaked from the storm the night before. I paused, unsure if I should interrupt, but she looked up and gave me that same subtle, layered smile, the one that made it impossible to step away. I found something," she said quietly, voice low, almost hesitant. She didn't look at me as she spoke, her gaze fixed on the letter as if it contained all the answers to questions she hadn't dared to ask. I took a tentative step closer. "What is it?" She hesitated, fingers tightening on the paper. "It's from him," she admitted finally. The name she didn't speak was heavy between us, a ghost from a life that was all but finished, yet still haunted her. She drew a slow breath, folding the letter carefully, and I noticed the faint shake in her hands. "I never thought I'd read it again," she continued, voice catching slightly. I thought I was done with all of this. Her eyes flicked up at mine, and for a moment, she was just a woman who had loved and lost, fragile in a way she never allowed anyone to see. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell her it was okay, that some things we carry are meant to be remembered, not erased, but the words felt small, useless even. Instead, I just moved a little closer and handed her a mug of coffee, letting the warmth between my hands reach hers. She took it, and our fingers brushed, again, but this time, the contact lingered a heartbeat longer, and I felt the subtle seismic shift that had been waiting to happen. I miss him sometimes, she admitted finally, voice almost a whisper. Her lips pressed together as if the confession itself was painful. I nodded slowly, unsure whether to speak or just remain present. Her vulnerability hung in the air, and I realized that it wasn't just about him. It was about all the walls she'd built, all the careful control she'd maintained, now softening in the presence of someone who wasn't supposed to be part of this memory. You remind me of some of it, I said finally, softly, more truth than I intended. Not him, exactly, but something in me stirred echoes of the person she had lost, the laughter and comfort she had once known. I saw her eyes widen, then soften, and the faintest tremble passed through her shoulders. We sat in silence after that, the letter resting on the counter between us like a bridge we weren't ready to cross. Rain tapped against the windows, the world outside moving on while we stayed suspended in this quiet gravity. Finally, she lifted her gaze, meeting mine fully for the first time in days. There was a strange mixture in her eyes, sadness, nostalgia, and something that hadn't been there before. Something like possibility, but unspoken. Then she exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, and whispered, I don't know if I'm ready, but I can't look away. And in that moment, the air between us shifted. The letter wasn't just a reminder of the past. It had changed the way we existed in the same room. A soft quake that neither of us could ignore. It was late when I returned the next day, the bookstore almost empty, the scent of rain still lingering in the air. She was perched on the edge of the counter, knees drawn slightly up, a book open in her lap, but clearly unread. I hesitated at the doorway for a moment, watching her, noting how the soft lamplight traced the lines of her face, made her silver-streaked hair glow like it had its own quiet energy. She looked up and caught my gaze, eyes lingering longer than necessary. I felt the familiar pull in my chest, the same quiet electricity that had been building for weeks, now heavier, almost tangible. She closed the book slowly, setting it aside as if to say, without words, that she had been waiting. You're here again, she said softly, not teasing, just noticing. The room felt small, private, like the world outside had disappeared. I nodded, stepping closer. I wanted to make sure you were okay, I said quietly, aware of how clumsy my words sounded. But she only smiled faintly, a small upward curve that held so much meaning it nearly stopped my breath. For a long moment, we simply stood there, neither speaking, neither moving, letting the space between us carry all the tension and understanding that words had failed to capture. I noticed the faint tremble in her fingers as she rested them on the counter, the subtle exhale that seemed to let the weight of weeks slip from her shoulders. She tilted her head slightly, eyes searching mine, and I realized we didn't need to declare anything. Not yet, not in words. The truth of our connection was already there, in the shared glances, the quiet proximity, the unspoken agreement that we had been drawn to each other despite everything. I reached out slowly, almost hesitant, resting my hand lightly on hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let our fingers brush and settle together, warm and real. It was a small gesture, nothing dramatic, but it carried everything. Trust, acknowledgement, the quiet surrender of hearts that had been circling each other, wary and guarded, for far too long. She started, then stopped, letting the words hang. I shook my head gently, as if to say we didn't need them. She exhaled, a soft laugh, almost a whisper, and leaned slightly closer, her forehead resting briefly against mine. The contact was fleeting, yet it was enough. Enough to tell us both that we had crossed the invisible line into something real, something fragile but inevitable. We sank into the quiet together, sitting on the edge of the counter, fingers intertwined, neither speaking, neither needing to. The bookstore, the rain outside, the scent of coffee and old paper. All of it receded until the only thing that mattered was this simple, human closeness. And in that silence, in that gentle, earned connection, I understood that this wasn't about declarations, grand gestures, or rushing into what we felt. It was about being present, about letting the moment exist fully, fragile and perfect in its own right. We stayed like that for a long while, just two people finally allowing themselves to be seen, to be here, to be together without forcing the world to define it. And when she finally let go, just slightly, our fingers lingering, I knew that nothing else needed to be said. Looking back now, I realized that the bookstore wasn't just a place for books. It was the space where everything shifted, where ordinary days became quiet lessons in patience, attention, and the kind of connection that sneaks up on you when you least expect it. I can still feel the weight of those moments, the subtle touches, the long silences, the way her presence could fill the room without a single word. I've changed since then. I notice the small things more, how a person moves, the way their eyes shift when they're hiding something, the unspoken tensions that can linger in a single glance. I've learned that love doesn't always announce itself with fireworks or declarations. Sometimes it arrives as a soft, persistent gravity that reshapes the spaces we occupy, the thoughts we carry, and the boundaries we think we know. She's changed too. There's a gentleness now in the way she allows herself to be seen, a willingness to share both history and vulnerability. She still carries the scars of loss, the quiet weight of past heartbreak, but it no longer closes her off entirely. She lets connection in, slow and careful, and I think that's braver than anything else. We both learned something essential, that love doesn't have to be loud to be real, and that intimacy is sometimes measured not in gestures grand enough to make a story, but in the quiet consistency of being present for someone else, in the willingness to see and be seen, without forcing outcomes or rushing declarations. Even now, I remember the small moments, the faint brush of fingers on a book cover, the almost touch of our foreheads, the hesitant smile that said more than words ever could. Those moments carry a resonance that lingers, a soft echo in the corners of memory that reminds me of how fragile and beautiful human connection can be. I've carried that awareness into the rest of my life. The subtle attentions, the patience, the understanding that sometimes the greatest acts of love are the ones that don't need to be named. And she carries it too, in her own quiet way, though neither of us speaks of it aloud. The bookstore remains the same in many ways, yet everything feels different when I walk in. The shelves, the light, the smell of paper and coffee, they're the same, but now they hold the weight of memory, of lessons learned, of a bond that was earned slowly and carefully, and one that I will never forget. And in that, there's a comfort, that even without loud confessions or dramatic declarations, what we built together was real, enduring, and quietly transformative. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?